It's important to know how porn influenced the brain. There are thousands of men that have reported that porn can potentially be addictive, and they've reported a lot of different problems associated with this, and therefore a lot of communities are popping up all around the world on the internet. Science and well-supported research is lagging behind because it's still a relatively new problem. And when it comes to research, it typically takes several decades for many hypotheses and researches to accumulate in order to become well-supported theories. In addition to this could be additionally taboo because it's at the convergence points of many touchy topics such as adults' personal life, medical advice, men's health, and issues which men deal with, which we've got to say right now, it's very trendy for issues that men deal with to be deprioritized because we don't scream the loudest, nor do we scream the most on social or traditional media. There's just no screaming at all. My name is Jeff Lee. I have my master's degree in clinical psychology, experience in mental health and addiction field. And in addition to all of this, I'm also the host of the Ethose Center, where we provide a psychological guide to self-improvement and becoming an influencer. In this multi-series of videos, I'm going to go ahead and analyze and break down a mainstream piece of content, which is a very great job explaining the basics of understanding how porn influenced the brain. Again, this is a very basic and simplified understanding, but it is enough to explain to you if this is something that is affecting you or someone that you know so that you can better navigate your way around it since you have a fundamental understanding of how this is influencing you.
Internet porn is not Playboy, but I bet you already knew this. You know the centerfold of the magazine gets old pretty quick. Internet porn is really far more stimulating than just images. It's really due to the endless novelty and the ability to click from one image to another. Another reason internet porn is so stimulating is that it can escalate rather quickly to more kinky or more shocking material.
So they made a really important point here in the video, and when I first learned about this when I was in grad school and started working in the addiction field, when they emphasized specifically high-speed internet pornography, I thought that was such an odd thing to mention because nowadays the assumption is kind of like everyone has high speed. It's kind of just become a standard. But it is really important to emphasize because I'm sure many of you could watch this can already relate to when we had dial-up internet. You know what I'm talking about? It's like with the monitor when they went right? It's like your computer is becoming alive, but that's when we had dial-up. So things really changed, and these tube sites were only able to flourish and to develop much more recently when we had high-speed internet. And in the context of the entire history as well as the developing world, it's only been about the past decade and a half that we've had this high-speed internet that allowed these tube sites, YouTube, as well as all the other adult tube websites to actually flourish. And that has a huge impact on the way that we interact with it and how it affects us. So this is a very new development.
Now, the standard model is that you have to have a predisposition. You have to be genetically inclined to get addicted. Well, this is definitely true. But what we found out is that many of the guys who were showing up on the site had never had any other addiction. They were just regular guys who started watching and got hooked. And what's interesting is once they got off a porn session, they returned to their, quote, normal selves.
So we've really got to make the distinction between behavioral addictions and substance. A lot of times they're co-occurring, but with substances, it's a lot more apparent and physiological because there's substances involved. There are things happening to your brain, there's actual chemicals, and it's a lot more clearly defined, as opposed to behavioral, which does affect your brain, so it is physiological in a way, but there's a night and day difference between the two. So with behavior, we are pioneers in the way that we are still studying this. I'm still studying this. Like it's still so cutting edge that it's not in the DSM-5 or the ICD-11, which are the two manuals which a lot of clinicians and medical professions refer to in order to diagnose. And so this is very cutting edge. So we're still trying to get the research together to provide evidence for these type of things. But from a lot of what we know so far, a lot of addictions typically have a genetic component. But with pornography, they find that even standard people who don't have any apparent addictions or any apparent inclinations or prerequisites are becoming addicted to pornography. Now, trauma is a different story, but it seems like there's a strong genetic component, but also it can just happen to the layperson without any apparent cause when it comes to genetics.
Porn overstimulated your brain, and your brain changed. You see, being hooked on porn is due to the same brain changes that occur with all addictions. These brain changes are behind your cravings. These brain changes keep you coming back to porn, even if you want to quit. The internet porn is what we call a superstimulus. What that means is that it's way beyond what we've ever encountered during our evolution. Here's the big picture. We're a hunter-gatherer brain, living in a modern world. Our environment has drastically changed. I suppose I don't need to tell you that, yet our brains have barely evolved in the last 100,000 years. This means we are not well suited to many aspects of modern life. From living in isolated boxes, to going to work, to working in desk jobs, to worrying about global warming or the economy. We're supposed to be sitting around the campfire, not sitting in front of a computer watching internet porn for hours a day.
Nearly every experience that we have changes our brain. This is also relatively new, that's found in neuroscience just the past several decades, because the thinking before was that our brain was static at a certain period. You go through puberty, you go through adolescence, you go through young adulthood, and then your brain is basically just fixed. That's just the way it is. Your brain hardly changes after that. But we did find that the brain is actually very plastic, and there's a tremendous amount of neuroplasticity that goes on, a certain type of flexibility in which it changes with certain accidents, nutrition, drug use, the way that we think, the way that we feel when we get stressed and there's more cortisol. So our brain is actually very flexible, and it's constantly changing through our days, through our life. And in this footage, it basically reiterates that our biology is not used to many of the things and many of the stuff that's changing in our modern times. When it refers to superstimulus, they talk about stimulus, things that we engage with, that we get excited about, things that captures our attention. It's stimulating, right? It's a stimulus. Pornography is a super stimulus because it's something that is additionally more stimulating than the natural thing. And so the natural thing is the hanky-panky, right? Like the interaction, the intimate interactions that we have with another special individual, right? So that is the normal natural stimulus. And it's become processed, cleaned up, polished, and enhanced so that you get only the most concentrated item, the concentrated stuff from that. It's extracted and it's extremely refined, and it gives you just the highest amount of pleasure for what it used to be, right? There's no work that needs to be involved. You don't need to build up your communication skills, your skill set, your personality, or anything. It's highly refined. It's become a super stimulus. Another super stimulus, which is really wreaking havoc in the Western world, especially the US of the Americas, as well as the UK, is food, processed food. So we got a more natural stimulus. Food that's not very stimulating, it's normal. Meats, carbs, breads, grain. And every once in a while, we will come across things that are more fatty, more rich, and have a lot more calories and sugar. But what we've done is we've transformed this into a super stimulus by concentrating it, made it extremely strong, removing all the things that aren't as engaging and stimulating, and we've made it more sugary, more salty, more fatty, and extremely convenient. So that's another super stimulus that is kept in mind.
Here's another example of environment changing, and our brain's not quite catching up. I haven't seen too many pictures of fat hunter-gatherers. Have you? And yet, 70% of Americans are overweight. So what's going on? Our brains are programmed to love high-calorie foods. That's necessary for survival. In the old days, it was very rare to find high-calorie foods, maybe honey, sweet fruits, nuts. Today, we have refined carbohydrates and high-fat junk foods. All of these are highly stimulating, so they cause supernormal stimulation way beyond anything we've ever encountered. Just like internet porn. Brain rule number 1 says, you must survive, which means get calories. For food, that means get it while the getting is good, because you don't know when something's going to rot, at least in the old days. So your primitive brain is urging you to binge at every opportunity, to get as much as you can. This leads to overconsumption. This rule also applies to sexual partners.
This is what we really forget, is that we don't look back in history and we have a very narrow perspective, because our biology and the way that our body has changed has taken course over thousands of years. It's not as quick as technology, or it's not as quick as when we pick up a term or anything like that. We have old parts of our brain that is used to very slow transformation. We're not like a phone that quickly gets an app update. So with all these things going on, we could understand it logically, but many times it's very overwhelming, and our older primitive brain is not able to adapt. So sometimes we know better, but we don't do better because we're still on this old behavior, and we're still drawn to these natural ways of being that we're priorly programmed to do. The more recent parts of our brain, which is able to reason and to learn and to be rational with things, we can understand these ideas conceptually, but a lot of times we still feel like we're compelled to do these type of things. And we've got to really keep in mind that a lot of times we have this disdain or this belittling of these older programs because it seems primitive and out of date. And yes, but at the same time, I think it's really important to appreciate and understand, having a more positive perspective, that this way of behaving was very helpful in those days. If you left it only to the logic part of you, it would take too long in order to respond and to react and to plan these type of behaviors, that by the time you're ready to take action, either through with a partner or with scarce food that has a lot of calories, and you need to really consume it in order to save yourself from starvation or the next famine, it could already be over, or the opportunity could already be gone. So by having this really deeply ingrained old pre-programming, it kept you alive. it's the reason that you were able to be passed on and be able to be here today. So I think a more helpful way of seeing this programming and our natural tendency is to be appreciative, but then also to use our logic to understand that that is not necessarily the best way to act or be anymore. I appreciate what got me here, but I can't always continue to be doing that because it's not conducive to a modern life today. Now that you know a little bit more about porn, superstimulus, and its effect on the brain, you're better able to navigate how you use it and how to interact with it in a more healthy way, preferably to reduce it so that you hardly interact with it at all, but also to understand superstimulus, how it really draws in your biology, and at one point, it was helpful, but now not so much anymore. Stay tuned for the next video because then we'll be talking a little bit more about the research and different types of lab experiments on how porn influence the brain.